just want to go back to bed. But, it's important too. And we're talking about caring for creation, and those other people around you are creatures. So let's start there. Also, it's a good chance just to get to know each other and some folks. So if you don't mind, what I would really encourage you to do is try to say hello to somebody who maybe, if you're sitting right next to your best friend, somebody that maybe you're not. So, at Dayspring, we usually formalize this with the passing of the peace, which we had to kick to the curb during COVID. But we don't have to formalize it quite so much right now. But if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to break through your early morning coffee process to greet somebody. Would you do that, please? Just say, good morning and welcome. Good morning. Hey, Carl. Good morning.
Good morning.
Looking forward to being back with you on Tuesdays. Yeah. Hi, Peggy. Hi, Susie. Good morning. Fair. Okay. That's quite enough of that. Now you're just filibustering. My invitation to you is before you leave this morning, if you met somebody new especially, greet them by name on the way out, but you have full permission to say, okay, I met you behind the mask, but remind me of your name. You have full permission to do that, okay? Full permission. I'd like for us to not only greet one another, but let's greet the morning and greet the Lord who gathers us together. O Lord, our God, maker of us all, giver of this day, we thank you. Let us enter into this day with gratitude and thanksgiving for who you are among us and for us, for all that you do within us, and for the gift of Sabbath day. Today, we rest in you. We set our minds, our hearts, our bodies, all into your hands, and we entrust ourselves, our community, and our world to you. Renew us in our faith, in our joy, and in our love for you in all things. Be with those who are brokenhearted. Be with those whose bodies are broken too, and communities and nations. We trust you, God of grace, to be sufficient in every situation. Hear our prayer. We lift it up to you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. If you've been with us for a few weeks in person, or some of you joining us online, you know that we've been walking through a season of creation, and we continue this morning. We're walking with Moses. The story of Moses at the burning bush is our guiding scriptural image. Just that we're taking from that story lessons, but we're entering into that story. Where do we find ourselves there? How do we follow the rhythms of that story as we, like Moses, see something in God's world that is telling us something and maybe revealing something to us and maybe changing us for God's mission? So let's read up to the point where we are again today. Chapter 3 of Exodus. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. It's that last line, here I am, that seems instructive for us this morning as a guiding moment in the story. And I think it's part of the story we overlook. It's just Moses sort of saying, here I am. We remember that's exactly what Adam and Eve didn't do. Remember this? God called to them, where are you guys? Oh, we're not here. But here's Moses saying, here I am. It seems to be out of curiosity and naivete more than it is out of confidence of actually knowing where he is and actually knowing who he is. Moses is long on the far side of his experience of being chased from the community he was from, everything he knew, on the far side of the west side of the mountain, out keeping this flock of sheep. He's a long way from anything he's ever known or any place where he'd expect to encounter God. So when Moses says, here I am, an interesting question comes up. Does he even know where he is? And do we? Do we even know what ground we're standing on? And I think that's an interesting question as we frame a look at ecological crisis, contemporary culture, our own lives. Where are we actually standing when we're doing those things? When we're concerned about those things, when we're seeking God in our midst? Where actually are we? So I think that's an interesting way to frame it, and we'll continue that quest today. We're going to begin by reviewing somewhat quickly what we did last week. Some of you are with us, and it'll be review for you. Some of you are new, and I hope that you'll be able to catch quickly what we're doing, because I'd like to move toward what happens now. So the first part is what we're framing as rifts. A rift is a tear, it's a break, it's something that's supposed to be complete but has been severed. And we're looking at our whole current situation as a series of rifts rooted in a metabolic rift. Metabolic rift being the idea that there is a cycle of life that humans were intended to be a part of, and in the modern industrial era, we're acting as if we're not. We're living and acting as if we're not part of the cycle. And we've broken it, and that has ripple effects. Or maybe the result of other rifts that are within us. So first of all, what's the tangle, and then how do we untangle it? It becomes the question, and you'll see that coming up. So I hope you can see this. The slides are on the YouTube. If some of you are watching, we posted the slide deck on the YouTube channel, so you can follow along if you can't see. So we've already talked about Moses. Where are we? This is our framing story. There's two really nice icons posted out in the narthex. Invite you to look at those. Okay, so last week we talked about, we spent quite a bit of time looking at how do we process information that scientists give us about carbon in the atmosphere. Like how do we make sense of these kind of numbers when we're not equipped to do so at all, and not just intellectually, like most of us aren't scientists, but also emotionally, psychologically, and theologically. How do we make sense of these kinds of matters? We're not going to revisit this whole story, but it does frame the question when we realize we are faced with information on the scale of ecological ages crashing down on us like a wave that's been building in the ocean, and now we're just right here on the shore and it's crashing on us. Where did that wave come from? How do we make sense of something this big and this complex? We talked about it. Is it sin? Is this a sin that carbon in the atmosphere has reached this level? If so, in what way is it a sin? How exactly is that a sin? And if so, whose sin is it? Is it yours? Did you cause this elevated carbon in the atmosphere? Well, you probably contributed to it, but was it all your fault? No. So what do we do with that? How do we deal with this on an individual level, on a communal level, on a worldwide level? Sin becomes a complex question. And of course, that's important because we want to be right with God, but also we have been formed as a people to know that confessing sin, being honest about our sin, understanding it, and repenting of it is how we grow spiritually. It's what Christ enables us to do by his death and resurrection, is to be freed. But how can we be free from lifestyles that are so thoroughly enmeshed in creating carbon levels that are this elevated? It gets complicated really quickly. We had a nice discussion about that last week. This is a sort of technical introduction to the idea of metabolic rift. Metabolism we might think of as cellular level, or our bodies. That's how most of us use this language, is our bodies have a metabolism. I think the way we usually think about this is we get older, what happens to our metabolism? You know, all I have to do is look at a cheeseburger and I put on 2 pounds. And we'd say, oh, my metabolism is what? Slowing down, right? So, I mean, you know, our bodies process food as fuel and generate energy and life from that. Well, the whole planet does. There's an input and an output. And so this requires a cycle. And we talked about this. So there's 3 kinds of rifts in cycles. One is an ecological or metabolic rift that is actually the rift in how there's a rift that humans have created in how we relate to soil and sky. And the modern industrial age has just thrashed those. There are others that are related to it. And one, there's a social and communal rift, which is a rift in our relationships with one another. And in a macro sense, the relationship between the point of consumption and the point of production. Now, just briefly, what I mean by that is the industrial age separates those so that people who are working hard to produce things aren't anywhere near the people who are spending their money to consume things. And the question we asked last week, just to highlight it, is when was the last time you ate something that you grew or raised or killed and cleaned and harvested yourself? I'm not criticizing you for that. I'm in the same boat. But when was the last time? When was the last time you wore something that you actually made? When was the last time you entered a building that you actually constructed? You see my point? We're separated. We're distant from the people who are in the places where things are being produced to where they're being consumed. And the most dramatic example of that is town to city, or really countryside to city. You know, we just don't see where our food comes from anymore. So we don't ask those questions because 83% of us live in cities. And then there's an individual and spiritual rift. Now, I really want to be careful with reducing spirituality to just individuality, but we're going to stay there for now because we think of it that way. My own, personal relationship with God, my prayers, my faith, my belief. But I want us to remember that the way of thinking about spirituality is not just internal. It's not just my feelings or my prayers. Spirituality means my whole way of life lived with the Holy Spirit. So a spirituality is how do we respond to the Holy Spirit, certainly with our prayers and our belief and our theology, but also with the way we live. And individuals have a spirituality and whole cultures have a spirituality. So what is the spirituality of modernism? Well, how do we live our lives? How do we live our lives in any way in relationship to the God who's creator, redeemer, and sustainer? So that question, I want us to hang there. So this is another way of mapping these 3 rifts: metabolic rift, social rift, spiritual rift. And forgive me for the clumsiness and clunkiness of this drawing. I'm not good at PowerPoint, but this is, I think, gets to some of the point, which is, where did it begin? What's the root of this problem? And I think it's, in all my reflection on this, I don't know. But I think it's wound up with all of this. I think somehow the earth and society and our relationship with God, all of these, it's more like a spiral than it is a straight line. I think that there's a relationship between all of these, and we'll come back to that later on this morning. We looked at this beautiful picture last week. So let's start here. I know this is fuzzy, but it's pretty simple still. So things grow. Where do they grow? In soil, in the dirt, right? And then the things are harvested, and this is a happy person eating. He's got a very full plate. That plate is as big as his body. It looks like there's something white there, maybe some mashed potatoes, and there's something brown there. I don't know what that is, but that looks like a whole lot of meals I ate growing up the child of Southerners. And he looks pretty happy. Then he is on the loo with a book, and this is extreme. Now, we're going to take this picture as symbolic. It is literal, of course, and that's important, but symbolic of the larger ways of what we do with our refuse and our trash. So that's what is represented here. And ideally then, in the metabolic cycle, that's returned to what? What's this part here? Compost, soil. So what is excreted and the leftovers from human use is returned to the soil where it breaks down and it gives the soil life, where then what happens with that soil? More stuff can grow. This is the cycle. This is what we've done to it. So we start here. Things still grow. People still eat. He's very happy. He's still doing this. And now that's called discard because it's not going back into the soil. It's instead turned into waste and pollution. So this is a model of the rift in the cycle. When we don't recycle, when we don't compost, we put things into landfills or into lakes and rivers and so forth. Now, a lot of work has been done in the last 50 years to clean up our rivers. I was talking to my dad about this last Friday night. He said, growing up in rural Alabama, we did not swim in the river. You didn't go in the river. You didn't eat anything out of the river. I'm like, why? It was rural Alabama. Seems like it should be pristine. He said, that river flowed through Atlanta. He said, you knew not to do anything out of that river. And he said that there was a cotton mill there. He said, as boys, we'd go traipse around, trespassing and everything. Of course, they all worked in the cotton mill, too. He said there was a huge pipe that extended out over the river, and stuff just flowed out of it. He said, we didn't know what it was, but we knew not to get in the river. Well, since the 1960s, a lot of that's been cleaned up. These are tremendously positive steps for our rivers and streams and lakes. A lot of work has been done, and we should be proud and grateful for that. 40%, though, of our landfills are filled with things that could have gone back in the soil. Do you realize that? 40%? There's a big mountain rising in Woodway right now. Imagine if that was half as tall after all these years, or even less. Oh, there's just food in that thing. It smells like it, too. So because we're not putting compost back in the ground, we had to invent things because soil still needs the nutrients, and that's where synthetic chemical fertilizers, that industry rises, and that's what we dump onto the soil to try to make, try to fix this problem. And but we're learning that there's problems here caused by what we're doing here, and there's definitely problems here by what we're causing here, and that leads to problems here. The cycle's rifted. So I think that this represents what God has intended for the earth, and this is what we're doing. Now, what do we do with that? So we talked about rifts last week. That's the metabolic rift. This is some examples of social rift. We talked about this just a few minutes ago. This especially affects minorities and poor communities. It undermines overall community cohesion. And we talked about the separation of labor from consumption. This is a real hallmark of the modern world. So again, just really quickly, I wanted to point out this morning, again, how our society, our culture, our relationships are affected by how we treat the land and in turn affect how we do it. But that's not all. The third rift, and we didn't spend much time on this last week, and this is really where we're going to kind of launch into this morning, is the spiritual rift. There is a spirituality here. And there's lots and lots of people who've written about this and thought about it and so forth. I'm going to give you just 3 sources and just briefly give you a kind of thesis statement for each. The first is very, very famous. 1969, Lynn wrote an article called The Historic Roots of the Ecological Crisis, and he blamed it on Christians mostly. He said Christians from the medieval age forward have been the people on earth to separate their belief about the care for the earth from their spirituality. He put the whole root of ecological crisis at the feet of Western Christians. Now, most Christians after that said, what are you talking about, Lynn White? And there were lots of books written that said, it's not our fault. Well, they're right. It's not entirely our fault. But it's also sort of our fault. He's not entirely wrong. So this is a very important article. You can find it online, and it is referenced by every single thing that's written about ecology and Christianity from then on. So if you ever want to read into this, study more, that article you'll find referenced everywhere. It is a gateway article into this whole conversation. Everybody negotiates that article one way or the other. It's very important. But it does highlight, it begins to at least pose the question of what role do Christians have in causing the problem. To me, the more interesting question is, what role do we have in healing it? So we'll come back to that, of course. Second book I want to mention is from 1987, Paul Santmeyer. I've referenced this already. The Travail of Nature, that's from Romans 8. The Ambiguous Ecological Promise of Christian Theology. So Santmeyer said, this was now 15 or 20 years since people have been writing from Lynn White, and Santmeyer said, well, let's take a hard look at the Bible and see what it says. Is it true that Christians are being defensive, saying, no, the Bible tells us to care for the earth? Or is it true that Lynn White is saying, no, you people reading the Bible says your spirituality is just about escaping from the earth? And Santmeyer read the scripture and read a history of Christian interpretation for 2,000 years and said, well, it's complicated. It's ambiguous. There's themes in the Bible that certainly give rise to a theology of just leaving the earth behind and escaping, but there's also themes which lead to not just caring for the earth, but finding your identity here amongst the creatures. And he said this is all here. That's why he calls it ambiguous. And there's Christian movements and thinkers all through history that have emphasized sort of one dimension or another. I find this kind of thing very helpful because it feels honest to me. It doesn't feel whitewashed. It feels honest. And so if I feel some ambiguity, Santmeyer's saying, okay, that's fine. Let's accept that. Now let's go forward with that in hand. I find that sort of thing pretty helpful. John Markey in 2014 wrote a book called Moses and Pharaoh's House, A Liberation Spirituality for North America. And I want to spend a little bit more time here because Markey also deals with our Moses story. But Markey does it in a different place in the Moses story. He goes upstream from our story of Moses at the burning bush. Now what Markey says, the image that Markey wants to present is Moses when he's in Pharaoh's house. Now, do you remember Moses in Pharaoh's house, how he got there? He was floating down the river from his mama in the basket, and he's plucked out of his mama's a Jew, and the Jews are being, they're already enslaved, and now it's even worse. And he's plucked out of the river by who? Do you remember? Yeah, Pharaoh's daughter. And so Moses is taken into the house where he's adopted as part of the family and becomes a prince of Egypt. So here's what a great story. So here's Moses, who by all accounts should have floated down the river to his death. Now he's the prince of Egypt. Now he is living in the lap of luxury. The walls are gold. If Moses is sitting here, that's made of gold. He's got it made. Moses can live the rest of his life in comfort and security. But something in him says, this is not who I am. This is not who I was made to be. Something's not right about this. And he has this instinct. It's not yet cultivated. He doesn't yet fully understand, but he knows something's wrong. And so Markey takes us right to that point and says, for Moses to recognize that God is moving in him, to recognize something's wrong about where I'm living, he has to leave Pharaoh's house. He has to leave those walls of comfort and security and power. He has to leave them to go out to be with those who are suffering. He says that is the place North American Christians find ourselves. We are Moses in Pharaoh's walls. Comfort and security and power. And if we don't leave those walls, then we're still stuck there and we'll go on living our lives as children of Pharaoh and not children of the living God. So what are the walls? Markey gives them 3 walls, which is a person who was trained for some time as an engineer really bothers me. There's got to be a 4th wall there somewhere, right? That building's going to fall. But nevertheless, here is Markey's take on contemporary culture, which are our 3 walls. And one of these days, Be helpful to do a book study on this, but he basically says there's three: individualism, envy, and superficial optimism. That this is our culture is run thick with these three characteristics, and in fact our culture promotes them and celebrates them and says this is the solution to all our problems, and Markey says none of these three are from God, and yet they're replete here. So a radical individualism: I am the center of the world, and whatever I want, I have the freedom to go and pursue, and anything I want, I should get. Now, if you're doing the same thing, then this strife-filled negotiation between us will somehow work out a society. So it's not I care for you, and I'm going to help you achieve your fullness. It's rather I'm going to battle you, and together this negotiation point will be what our economy and our culture is sort of based on. This is how Congress works. This is how the economy works. Second is envy. So this is materialism. Commercials. We are fueled by the need to envy what other people have so that I, work harder or try to obtain it. And that keeps the economy moving. It keeps everything moving. But this is not of God either. So I desire the cultivation of material desire we're run thick with. And the third is superficial optimism. And I found this interesting because it's not, I think any of us sort of critiquing culture would have probably come up with these first two. But the third one I found actually interesting in a way because I didn't expect it. So what he says is that we have the superficial idea that if we can do it, we should do it. And if we can do it and should do it, then it's going to work out just fine. So that takes us back to here. We can chemical fertilizers. We can do it, therefore we should do it, and it's going to work out just fine. Or whatever the problems are with this, we can solve them by more technological solutions. We have an optimism. Optimism is a great thing. He calls it a superficial optimism, which I think is interesting. And also optimism is different than hope. Optimism and hope are two different things. How do we negotiate that? So that's Markey. I want to end this part of it by quoting a fairly extensive passage. It'll take 2 slides from Joseph Sittler, who was writing this in the early 60s, I think. And Sittler wrote a lot about these kinds of things, reflected on them before even Lynn White did. Sittler's a Christian, University of Chicago. And Sittler's trying to do something that I also have been thinking a lot about, which is this. How is it that concern about, ecological issues is exactly a Christian concern? Let me give you the reason why this is prompted in my mind. Several years ago, I did a little project where I interviewed several seminary students about their relationship with and experience with creation, their care for creation, and so forth. And it was an interesting project, and I really enjoyed talking to them. Each one of them, to varying degrees, had some, care for, concern about the creatures, whether it be the land, the soil, the animals, etc. Pieces of land that they knew well. But when I got to pressing them on, how did you learn to be concerned about that? Where did this come from? Almost every one of them said, I've never heard a sermon about it. And I asked y'all that question on the survey. Do you remember this? And you're like, I don't think I've ever heard a sermon or Sunday school class about this. I've never had this connected for me. They said, here's what they said. They said, I watched a Netflix documentary. Or I read an article about it, or I read this book, or, we have a ranch and we've seen, we have to care for the creatures on that ranch or something. But none of them had anything to do with theology or spirituality. I mean, there was a spirituality, but it wasn't rooted in that. It wasn't rooted in what is the nature of Jesus Christ, and how does that lead me to then care for a world into which he became incarnate? That was not their question. What does it mean to come and take the Eucharist every Sunday, and for Christ to embody himself in bread and wine, grape juice, that I take into myself? What connection does that make between God, myself, and the creation? That was not their question. It was, I saw a Netflix documentary. And I have no problem with that. But it really struck me of the church is just, that question that I asked earlier about the carbon in the atmosphere, the question isn't just, is this a problem? You know, is this a problem we can solve somehow? Remember what the question was? What was the question that I posed? Do I have to go back through all the slides? What was the question about carbon in the atmosphere, the elevated level of carbon in the atmosphere? Is this sin? Sin is a theological word. It's a church word. Is this sin? Was the question. So Joseph Sittler frames this in theological language, which I find this helpful. So let me unpack it a little bit. Let me read it. It is difficult but impossible to get people to understand that pollution, this article is specifically about pollution, that pollution is biologically disastrous. What does that mean? Dangerous to life. Aesthetically offensive. What does that mean? I think one of you says ugly. Equally, obviously, economically self-destructive. That takes a lot of unpacking, but somehow or another it's bad for the economy. And socially reductive of the quality of human life. We talked about that a little bit already. So it's difficult but possible to get people to understand that pollution is biologically disastrous, aesthetically offensive, equally obviously economically self-destructive, and socially reductive of the quality of human life. But it is a very difficult job to get even Christians to see that so to deal with creation is Christianly blasphemous. What is blasphemy? How would we define blasphemy? We might just go back to the Ten Commandments. Taking God's name in vain. Yeah, we could start with that to think about what blasphemy means. So here's a theological, biblical word. We can see the problem through these lenses, but what does it mean to see it through this lens? So when we talk about a spirituality here, we're not just talking about the way I feel or something. What does it mean to call it blasphemous? And here's the rest of the quote. From a Christian point of view, the ecological crisis presents us not simply with moral tasks, but requires of us a freshly renovated and fundamental theology of the first article. Now, the first article is, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. The first article of the creed. From a Christian point of view, the ecological crisis presents us not simply with moral tasks, but requires of us a freshly renovated and fundamental theology of the first article, whereby the Christian faith defines whence creation was formed, and why, and by whom, and to what end. The word essential to such renovation is not the social, aesthetic, economic, or even scientific word, but the Christian word, blasphemy. I'm interested in what's your first responses to that? What your thoughts are about that, this sort of framing? What questions or comments or insights does that raise for you? Okay, so for Christians, understanding that first article, I believe in God the Creator, is to have your theology worked out right about who God is and what the creation is, and they're not the same thing. I'm also not God, which is a form of blasphemy. So I should stop acting like God. There's all kinds of things there. Good. Anything else? Yes, Ron.
To proclaim God as creator, but then to be indifferent about creation would be to be indifferent about God.
Could everybody hear that? Ron, you're a preacher. You're going to have to talk louder. I know you can do it. That was so good, I want everybody to hear it.
To proclaim God as creator, but then be indifferent about creation would be to be indifferent about God.
So saying, I believe in God the Creator, has a moral claim on our lives in ways that we might not have thought about so much, but you're rooting right there in the creed. Very good. That doesn't work out all the difficult details, but that's a framing, that's a foundational orientation that you're giving us. Very good, Ron.
Creation is not just a past. God created Earth.
Joanne, you're a teacher. I know you can project. I want them to hear it.
God created Earth. Sometimes we speak of that in the past tense, but it reminds us that we were in the present creation, and that we have a responsibility to see that now, not just as a then.
That's really good. So when we say the first article, I believe in God the Creator, we're not just telling a past story. God is the living God, resurrected Christ. God is still active in and among. I believe in God the Creator who is present among us. What does that open up in us? That's so good.
To look at it simply in moral test, treat creation as ultimate.
Explain what that means a little bit for us.
Well, then, this is the end to which all things tend. Once we treat creation, nature properly, we don't realize it's not ours. And it belongs to God, and to mistreat it is to ignore it. One quibble I would have with Settler is it's not just the first article of the creed, because the second article also says, through whom Jesus Christ, through whom all things were made, and for us and for our salvation came down from heaven. And so in a certain sense, it ties together even the very Christian mission of which we are a part.
That's so good.
That's an addition, not a disagreement.
For sure. Yes, Susie.
I think I was lucky enough to grow up on the coast, and we spent most weekends near the beach or on a boat or something like that. And I think at night there, because you didn't have lots of city lights, you'd really sometimes just be in so much awe of the sky, the stars, the reflections in the water, all that sort of thing. But I think it came through my mother, I'm not sure, or just sometimes, something I used to always be very aware of is God went to so much effort and planning and design to make this just right and so beautiful that for us to muck it up or do things against it was really working against God, and it was an insult to God, but it was also an insult to other people around us in the community. So if I'd be walking along the beach and there was a plastic bag or there was trash or whatever, we would always pick it up. And it would be trying to sort of rectify that. And it was partly our response to God, it was our duty to God, but it was also to other people around us. So I guess without preaching, I always connected it to sort of a duty to God, which is sort of like that.
Yes.
I can speak personally. I think it's easy, kind of going back to what's written here. I think it's easy to easier to answer the question of what is our place or how we should steward creation when we take, as Christians, or take the debate or the decision-making process outside of the church into the constructs of social, aesthetic, economic, where that stuff can be debated and there's disagreement there. But when we pull it back and connect it to creation, to the Creator, view it as the work of His hands, it becomes more personal and less about the issues and more about Him.
That's great. And the only I would like to add to that, makes it more personal and also I think hopeful and joyful. So it's not just this duty I have to do because there's some, but really it is the growth that it is part of, and perhaps an essential part of our response to God, which is, I think we find joy in that, you know. So there's a sense in the thing, yes, to build on that, it seems really important to me, and I think to you, that when we're looking at these issues and what do we do and how do we think about these things, that these are Christian questions, which means that Lynn White may be right, they're Christian faults, but more importantly now the question is, what is it about Christian life that brings about a healing in the rifts that we can recognize are true in and of ourselves? What exactly, where do Christians find their place here? Doesn't mean we don't have partnerships or can't listen to all those fields that have been mentioned, all those other scientific fields and so forth. But what's our role here? Christians are absolutely sitting on the sideline of this issue, particularly Baptist evangelical Christians. Totally sitting on the sidelines. And there seems to be this anxiety, which seems utterly misplaced, that the more I care about these things, the less I care about Jesus somehow. And I think what we're seeing is, and to Barry's specific point, no, actually, that's inverted. This is the opposite, you know. So that's that's what we're trying to do here, is to try to find these points of connection, our hope in all of this, so that it's not just blasphemy, but it's, you know, the positive part of this is worship. It's praise, it's prayer, it's honoring God. I mean, now you turn this around to what does it mean to actually participate in the healing of the rift. Now you can have a whole vocabulary list of all those words that speak to Christian life. A couple Wendell Berry quotes. Wendell Berry's a Baptist. There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. That's Berry's comment. And I like this one. The soil under the grass is dreaming of a young forest, and under the pavement, the soil is dreaming of grass. That's nice, too. We're going to talk about grass on Wednesday night with the Creeches. The Creeches would tell you, no, the soil under the grass isn't dreaming of forest. It's dreaming of more grass. So listen to the Creeches. Okay, so the question is, if we ask the question, how does the rift begin? The question is, where does the healing begin? Where do you start for the healing? Now, I want to be careful not to sort of offer this as a model. These things tend to be pretty clunky as models, but I do think it's a map. And if it's helpful that way, to think of it that way, here's a map of where you might start healing. So for Lynn White, for example, the earth cannot be healed, which is the ultimate goal in his view, I guess. The earth cannot be healed until we get our spirituality right. For ecologists, environmentalists, conservationists, the earth cannot be healed until we get our soil right, our air right. For folks working in eco-justice, you can't get it right until you get the relationship between rich and poor right, until we sort out our economy, our social relationships, that there's a brokenness so deep in any of them that until you repair one, you can't repair the others. That's pretty daunting. I'm not sure that's right, though I understand the point. It seems to me, and this is what I invite you to help me with, and I hope I help you, together, is where might all of these be so intertwined so that the place of healing is intertwined already with all three of these areas? Where in the world is there such a place where there's concern for spiritual things, the earth, and community things? Where might that be? You know where I'm going with this? You people. The church. Seems to me God has given the church as a witness to Jesus Christ, to God's Trinitarian creative and redemptive activity, that already from our very essence holds all three of this. I mean, if we don't hold it, at least we're oriented in all three of these directions. I mean, we could line up Scripture in all three of these But really the power is where they're intertwined together. You look at the prophets in the Old Testament. Almost every prophetic indictment against Israel has something to do with land, with community, and with relationship with, blasphemy of God. So, what ties this together? So, my thinking is, and I propose this to you for our consideration, is that in the church, in the gift of the church community, we have the opportunity and the resources to dive deep into the church's life and to find there motivation and resources, power, gifts, prompting that already touches on all of this. So one of the ways we're doing that is already out there. Nobody's going to get full off of eating the little bit we're growing in those little gardens, but it's symbolic of nothing else. We eat that. We have the leftovers, and look what you're bringing up to the church, the compost. Whatever you guessed, by the way, in that little game, if you're playing it, you guessed low. Go fill out another card and double what you guessed. Letting a little cheat code here. We'll announce that on October 10th. But, just in a very small little way, here's the cycle taking place right out here. I have an idea that not only is it the church that can be a place of healing of the rifts, but the church grounds are the place where the church can enact the healing of those rifts as a way to prompt our own, in our own homes and communities and institutions and beyond for the healing of the rifts. I'll give you one example, small example. So we started our little garden. We shared some food from there. Some of you brought food from home, which is great. We're bringing our compost. We're making compost. We have a little veggie garden. So one person at Dayspring got so inspired by this, they went to some local restaurants and said, hey, y'all have any food scraps? What do you do with those? And they were like, yeah, we got tons. We fill a dumpster with them. He said, well, how about I just leave this bin and I'll come back in a couple days and pick it up? And they're like, okay. He went back 2 days later, he couldn't pick it up. Brought it up here, it's in that out there. Told you, double your guess. And this is happening 2 or 3 times a week. So it's moving outward. So what happens here on the church grounds is already involving several local businesses. Isn't that interesting? So I wonder if the church grounds are a place where we activate our spirituality. There's a silent retreat this Saturday. What does it mean to just come and be still and listen? To activate our care for the land, to begin to activate our care for community around us. Now, we're going to talk about composting for a minute. And I don't know if if you're ready for this. We talk about compost. So my I guess a thesis statement I would say is this. Here's a thesis statement. The healing of the earth as God intends it is for us to heal the rifts. Those rifts are woven through all of our lives in our society and community. To heal those rifts, the world needs a church, and it has one. The church can activate that healing on its grounds. A principal way it can activate the healing of its grounds is through composting. Composting saves the world. Now, okay? So I don't know if we're ready for this, though. Any guesses what this picture shows? Looks like Del Barron? It does, but it's not. Anybody seen this picture? It was in the news just 2 days ago. It is a rolling compost bin, but let's look a little closer if you can see it. Rolling compost bin, Del Barron is standing behind it. Any idea? That's a big bin, isn't it? Yeah. How big is that bin? It's about the size of what, did you say? About the size of a person. It's human-sized. Guess what this is? No. And y'all, I teed you up for this. Listen to the article. In a suburban Denver warehouse tucked between an auto repair shop and a computer recycling business, Seth Vidal is dealing with life and death. He and one of his employees have built a vessel they hope will usher in a more environmentally friendly era of mortuary science that includes the natural organic reduction of human remains, also known as body composting. Now, what do you think you're looking at here? A kind of coffin, right. But, if you know anything about burial practices, what modern, coffins are designed to do is to preserve your body. This one is designed to compost your body. They put you in there, I guess, with some wood chips, some scraps, some cow manure. Let's see, I think it tells me this. 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, lined with waterproofing roofing material packed with wood chips and straw. 2 large spool wheels on either end allow it to be rolled across the floor, providing the oxygenation, so they roll you back and forth. Agitation and absorption required for a body to compost. He calls the process an exciting ecological option. And in death, he also sees life. Composting itself is a very living function. It's performed by living organisms. There are billions of microbial living things in our digestive tracts and just contained in our bodies. And when our life ceases, the life of those microbes do not cease. After about 3 months, the vessel's opened and the soil, that's you, is filtered for medical devices and prosthetics, pacemakers, or joint replacements. The remaining large bones are then pulverized and returned to the vessel for another 3 months of composting. Teeth are removed to prevent contamination from mercury and fillings. You with me so far? Have I completely lost you? I've lost you? Yeah, well, here we go. In 6 months, the body, wood chips, and straw will transform into enough soil to fill the bed of a pickup truck. Family members can keep the soil to spread in their yards. The Colorado law prevents selling it. It accomplishes the conversion of the body back to a very beneficial substance, soil, earth. Let's see, I think he already says how many. To dust, that's right, I am dust, and to dust I shall return. In Washington State, 3 businesses have transformed at least 85 bodies since a law took effect in May 2020. More than 900 people have signed up as natural funerals become more popular. Yep. Yes. So, yeah, thank you, Susan. I'd be interested to show a website about that. So, in other words, they don't put you in this thing in a warehouse and roll you around. They put you in the ground as something that decomposes, and you decompose into the ground. Yes. The Colorado Catholic Conference does not like this. A group of bishops aimed at molding public policy. They opposed it, saying, hold on, I lost it. It does not promote human dignity. Some rabbis are also against it because it violates Jewish religious law. Others are concerned there's not enough research on whether the compost contaminates soil, and there's no way to prevent people from using it in home vegetable gardens. We don't know what they're going to do with it if they take it all home, so-and-so said, from the Funeral Directors Association said. Okay, so listen. They recognize there's an ick factor here, and you may feel that completely, but just for one minute, literally, if we set that aside, are the Catholic Conference right? Does this not promote human dignity? If so, how? Does it in any way reclaim a kind of human dignity? Are the Jewish rabbis right that it violates Jewish law? I don't know what Jewish law is on this, but I think they have to bury the body quickly, at least in the ancient days. They put the body right in the ground. What do they think happened with it then?
Right next to one of the crematoria at Auschwitz, there's a huge field that contains somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 ashes of victims. And so I must admit, I'm not too favorable with this either.
Brings that back.
I just wonder if the same argument could be used, though, for our current burial practices.
I doubt anybody can hear you.
So that kind of critique, I just wonder, could we use that for some of our current burial practices, particularly like the preservation, the way we come bodies of chemicals and things like that. So that it cannot return to the earth. Right? I mean, why? I'd like to hear the rabbis talk about
So, thank you. We could have a whole day on just this, and maybe we should. We're out of time today, just about. Let me wrap up with a couple of things. I'm not proposing that we start this out here on our grounds. So just in case you're wondering about that. Second, I recognize anytime we talk about burial practices, this is a very personal thing. And it's, when I say personal, I mean, we think of people we've loved who've been buried. And that's, it gets right there very quickly. So I want to be careful to tread, not just, I don't want to be glib with any of this discussion. I also want to say that it does cause us to look at life and death in a new way, or in a different way. What does it mean? What do our burial practices mean and say about us? How do we think about God's gift of our bodies as essential to who we are? How do we think about that in relationship to the cycles of life? Those are good questions. Next week, we're going to move off of of Dale Barron a little bit. And I'm going to show you, we're going to look at some websites, we'll watch a couple of videos of some interesting ways that Christians are doing this with people who are living in places that are living. And we'll spend most of our time next week just exploring what are churches doing? What are Christians doing? And how might that enliven our imagination? So we'll start with that next week. Thank you so much. Terrific comments. I want to write down everything you've said and take them with me. So thank you very much. We've got about 10 or so minutes to prepare for worship, and we'll join you in worship in a few moments.